Hello YouTube, welcome to my channel. My name is Anthony. I have a bachelor's degree in game design and I'm currently looking for a position as a level designer. So I've decided to create this channel mostly to condense all of the best information I gather on level design, showcase my work, and also for tracking my learning progress. And this video is just a recap of the amazing GDC talk by Miriam Bellard, which is the art director for visual development at Rockstar North. And this lecture was back in 2019, so she's using mostly GTA 5 references, but I believe she's currently working on GTA 6 as well. Now, even though this lecture is 6 years old, the core level design concepts brought here are still the same to this day. So I made this PowerPoint with slides from her talk, but I added annotations, so it doesn't require much someone explaining the slides to get information across, even though that's exactly what I'm gonna do right now. But I really wanna stick the information and the learning while it's still fresh. So I'll provide the link to download the PowerPoint on the video's description below, and the link for Miriam's GDC talk, which if you haven't watched, I definitely recommend you do, and study carefully because that information is gold for us. Alright, let's get to it. Let me just switch here. Let me check OBS, see if everything is okay. Yeah, I do believe it is. Okay. So, environment design as spatial cinematography. Let me grab my laser pointer. So she starts by saying that this is the kind of work they do at her department. She called this privas, which I believe is just another term for gray boxing, if you're familiar with. We can see a blueprint here, some color pattern options, and I believe this is a reference board, and I'm not sure what this is. I think there's a mission in GTA 5 where you pilot a toy truck and everything is huge. I'm not sure. I mean, I played GTA 5 how many years ago? Can't even remember. Okay, so moving on. Cinematic experiences in video game. Now, just a quick side note. Cinematic experiences are usually used for narrative-driven games. Now, that doesn't mean you can't use in other types of games like open world games or first-person shooters, maybe even some kind of sports and racing, but I don't know, I think those are a bit different. But some of the concepts will overlap, of course. Okay, so even though the player is controlling the camera, we can still create cinematic experience. We just need to make those experiences by controlling the environment. Now here she's talking about the difference between different types of media, like movies. So in movies, you can control the camera, of course, but in games we can't. The player controls the camera. So how do we control the environment? By controlling this 2D screens, movement, and time. And how we can control the 2D screen? We compose the 3D for 2D. Because the end result is the same for movies or video games. It's the 2D screen. We're gonna see it's your TV, it's your monitor, or whatever. So here she's talking about composition and how we can't always have the best composition for every single shot the player is gonna look at. However, we can control certain points, so this is a starting point for the mission, which means we can control the composition of the starting point, and we can also control the end. So if we control the start, control the end, and as you go on the development process and tweak, you can also control a bit of the main parts. So the environment design has to work for everybody. Game design, environment art, art direction, narration. So these are the different themes that are gonna work And so this is why the level design work is so crucial. It's gonna be the central pillar for these teams. They are all gonna come back to the gray box, to the blueprint, and the mechanics, the actions that the level designer is is it gonna describe there. So that's why we have to build a solid base for, because every other department is gonna depend on this. And this is why she talks about focus on aesthetic and functionality, not just aesthetic. And this is the player view angle we showed before here, and how she's controlling the composition here. To the screen compose 3D for 2D, here we can see it also has a really nice composition on the second floor of that area. And one thing to note here is that the shapes, they didn't change too much on the final version. So I believe a lot of times the gray boxings may be too simple. I know it has to be simple shapes. You have to work fast and prototype fast, because you're gonna make a lot of sketches that are gonna be thrown away. But you can see how a more detailed type of gray box like this one carries over to the final product. So it does a lot of the heavy lifting for the other teams. So I do believe once you get the the general gray box, you can go ahead and detail to the player. So this is not it's kind of overlapping with some of the work an environment artist would do, but it's much better if we already build a solid base like this one. And here she shows another angle with a nice composition as well. And now here she talks about the rule of thirds. If you're familiar with, just look it up. I actually wasn't that familiar with. I need to study this a bit deeper. But for what I can tell is you want to have your elements separated in 3/3, so you can see nothing is too far, nothing is too close. You have an element here, which is the stair. You have an element here, which is the building. You have the element which is the center of this corridor, and this is part of the second floor. And now this, it's not really a composition except for this, but she's gonna talk about the top down and bottom up saliency, I believe, which is where the player looks. So if we have to focus our composition on those parts. Now here on the second floor, we can see we also have a nice composition. And here she gives us an example of a bad composition. And also how with minor tweaks, just pulling and pushing the geometry here and there, you can fix this type of problem. And this is the angle she's showing here. Also another problem, the tangents, which again, it's pretty easy to fix. You just have to push and pull the geometry. However, she says that the real difficulty here is actually finding the tangents. Sometimes they are hidden and we just can't see, but the player will eventually. Now here, different types of camera angle for action. So you see he's running here. So we have this type of composition and attention, but when the player is shooting, the context changes, so the camera changes also. It's just something to notice when you're composing for 2D. Now here she gives us a recommendation for a book, Principles of Composition in Photography. Just a small blog post to avoid tangents. And another book on, I forgot what this was. I believe it's also for composition. Okay, now she talks about depth. How can we create depth in video games? Using layers is one method. So you can see here the layers. Repeating elements, which are basically layers as well. When you have repeating elements over space, the space becomes much more readable, and we can understand really well the depth of the space we're in. Another tool is atmospherics. So you can see elements that are closer to the camera are more readable. Elements that are far away, you can't really tell what's going on there because the density of the particles increase with the distance. So that is also a nice tool to use. And excuse me, this is, she says that this is not exactly the level design. It's not work of the level designer, but it is very relevant to create depth. Responsibility, I was looking for the word. So it's not the level design responsibility because this is post-production. Another book on recommendation, The Visual Story. I also believe this is for depth, for creating depth. Yeah, of course, it's written here. Shapes on screen. Now this part is really interesting to me because I never really noticed before how she says that we evolved to feel a certain way based on the shapes we're seeing. I mean, shapes evocate a kind of feeling on us, and this comes from our evolution, and that totally makes sense if you think about it. So round shapes, safety feelings, because otherwise if you have jagged shapes like this, it's gonna correlate to things like teeth, spikes, things that hurt us. So I think that's really nice. And this is supposed to be the player house, I believe. So you want to feel safe in your house. And this is how the round shapes are working here. So it makes sense if you are in a hostile environment like this to make jagged shapes on the buildings. So it gives us the feeling of threat. And I think that's really nice. I never really thought about it. Now this horizontal vertical shapes relate to power control stability. This is also very much angle dependent if you think about it. If you position the camera like this, you get this feeling. I think about, I don't know, God of War. If you're walking inside Odin's temple and you see Odin temple sitting on the throne on the back, and you have these types of lines, and I don't know, it just gives us the feeling of power control. And also I think that's really nice as well. Now this one is a bit different because even though we have the vertical, the more straight lines, I think this is the initial angle when you come here, and it's your garage, I believe, where you keep your cars. So by positioning the camera here on this angle, you pass the some of the diagonal fields. But the most important thing here is actually the floor, because uh, as I put in the annotation here, texture, pattern, shadows, and camera view angles can override the overall feeling of the model shapes. So, which means that even though the lines are straight, we have this curved pattern, which gives the sense of safety. And now I just put shadows here because she mentioned, but shadows are not really doing much on this scene in particular. And also the angle, as I talked about, it's not an angle like this, so it doesn't pass the feeling of control power. This is a good recommendation on a book for shapes on screen. Picture this, How Pictures Work by Molly Bang. Okay, so 2D screen recap. In video games, we want to compose the 3D for how it's going to look on the 2D screen, which means create good compositions, depth, and interesting shapes. And then she goes on to movement, and how movement is also very different to control from movies and video games. And we're talking about movies a lot because these are cinematography experiences in video games, so it's relevant to the subject. Controlling movement in video games is difficult because the camera is attached to the player, so we need to influence where the player looks and goes. There's a name for this, and these are the names: saliency and affordances. Saliency controls where the player looks. Affordances control where the player goes. Now here, she does a quick myth busting, saying that there is an old myth talking how we can guide the player's eyes, or we can guide the viewer's eyes. Like in a painting, people would say, oh, this is being guided, so people are going to look here first, and then here second, here third, and it's going to end here. But we have eye trackers now, and we can see that that's not what happens in reality. In reality, we have a line and a line of attention, and our eyes are gonna be glued or attracted to parts of it, but not in a specific order. So we can see the eye tracker here. These are the paths where, not the paths, but the places where people are looking most, but it doesn't follow an order. This is very interesting. Also, I need to look at this. It's a study, actually, visual attention in 3D video games, and I think I found this study in online. I'm gonna try to post the link below as well. Because what's happening here? Even though the correct exit's been lit, this is the correct exit, players had trouble finding it. First trying doors and fireplace in spite of the fact that they were in darkness. Humans don't automatically walk towards the light. So she goes on by saying, if you are underneath some trees and there's some sun lighting up the ground, we're not gonna go towards that lit spot on the ground because it has no use for us. There's absolutely no reason. So that's what happens here. The player's gonna go to the door, not to this lit spot. And this is actually why a lot of level designers use the yellow lines, which are kind of a controversial topic here, because these lines break the fourth wall, and we're gonna talk more about that later. Now, what light can do, however, is it can help we see things that we might not otherwise see, and it can give spatial information that we might not otherwise have. So it's very useful in leading the player, but definitely not a direct one-to-one. Now here I put a lot of annotations because I actually didn't know about this, or I should say I knew, but I forgot It's been a while since I graduated, but in environment design, so these are called weenies, by the way. And I think I talked about environment design, especially in games and theme park. Weenies are visual landmarks or focal points that attract the players' or visitors' attention and guide their movement through a space. The term was popularized by Walt Disney. We used to describe large, eye-catching structures like Cinderella's castle. The idea is that people are naturally drawn to interesting or prominent visual features, just like how a dog would be drawn to a hot dog, a weenie. So I put this also. Game environment design, Weenie serves several purposes: navigation, pacing, emotional impact, and storytelling. So Weenies definitely work. Saliency and affordances. Saliency will control where the player looks, therefore where the camera goes. Oh, sorry, where the camera looks. And affordance will control where the player goes, and therefore where the camera goes. Saliency equals attention. So I think this is part of the weird images we saw on the first slide. But now here she talks about how there's top down, bottom, and bottom up. Yeah. So bottom up attention and top down attention. Now, bottom up attention means that the attention is more on the bottom. So if you have a something like driving, you need to see the floor well where you're driving to hit the obstacles. But the most used for in our case it's gonna be definitely the top down, because she says here that, where is it, I don't want to jump too much ahead. Okay, but I'll say, but I remember I annotated this further ahead. But she says that uh, top down attention is when you have a more goal or task oriented mode. So in narrative driven games that happens all the time. So we're gonna have primarily this type of attention, the top down one. And now saliency by contrast, which is pretty simple, sense by color, by size, by shape, by orientation, by texture or pattern, and by movement. This ball was moving on the presentation, but I just took a screenshot, so it's still here. Top-down saliency, meaningful. Meaningful, I put this because it's examples of saliency with meaning. So if you see human faces, they are definitely meaningful to us, so very salient. Humans in general, ball, but this is gonna be context dependent. Now, actually, these three are context dependent, as you see. So ball in context like sport, shoes in context like work, bottles in context of needs like thirst. And these objects that affect safety are always salient as well. So final saliency is a mix of bottom-up and top-down saliencies. How much saliency comes from bottom-up and how much comes from top-down depends on what mode that we're in. The more goal task oriented mode, more task, I don't think I should put this, I'm gonna fix later. So more task goal oriented equals more top-down saliency, as I was talking about earlier. And this is a good eye tracking study on saliency as well. As we can see, humans tend to look to things that are meaningful. So I forgot about, but she talks some part about how they would expect the player to look at the stairs, but in reality what happens is they look here because there's something written here, and they look to stuff like windows that correlates directly to people. So it's interesting to see, and of course things like possible paths, possible ways. this is where our eyes go and not really much on anything else. Now, this is a pretty underground YouTube video, I would say. She recommends a lecture on visual attention and consciousness. I don't even know what major this is, but I need to look later. Another YouTube video, introduction tutorial on visual attention and visual saliency, which I also plan to study a bit more later. An academic study on visual attention in 3D video games by Maggie Seif. I'm not gonna try and say that. So, affordances equals control where the player goes. Now here we have affordance relate to the actions that an object allows. So a chair allows sitting, a car allows driving, a door allows opening and walking through. A lot of time in video games there are misperceived affordances when something looks like it does something but it actually doesn't, like chairs used only for decoration and world building. So of course in video games we have to use these types of objects all of the time, but that doesn't mean they all are gonna be interactable. A lot of times, most of the times, they are just for decoration. So that's when we have a misperceived affordance. Signifiers. Using signifiers are a possible solution to this type of problem, misperceived affordance, which are arbitrary signals that the player needs to learn that communicate affordances. So green equals gold, that's a universal thing. Yellow tends to stand out. Now here we're talking about what I said earlier about this breaking the fourth wall. Yellow colors are often used to indicate interactables. And signs and symbols are universal signifiers. So here I put the one thing to be aware with signifier is that they break the fourth wall to a certain extent. So we have to be careful how much we're gonna use and how much we expect to break the fourth wall. There's some games there's absolutely no problem to break the fourth wall. It's expected. But in games like, I don't know, The Last of Us, you really don't want to break the fourth wall too much. That's why you even have a sort of a minimalist HUD for the player to break the fourth wall as little as possible. A YouTube video recommendation on affordances, how design teaches without words. And this is an article defining the environment language for video games by Emilia Schatz. Another book recommendation, The Design of Everyday Things. This is a cool study where they did using bots, I believe she said. Sometimes it's hard to understand her accent. She's from New Zealand, I believe. I'm from Brazil. I believe there's probably a lot of times where it's difficult to understand my accent as well. Anyway, so this is interesting. Surface affordances, paths taken by people in a gallery. Humans tend to walk more towards large walkable surface areas. So we can see here, I think this is a good spot to analyze. If you come across an intersection and you have a choice to make, and you look to your right and you see this small room, you look to your left and you see this large room, you are more inclined to take this path. Now, why does that happen? I'm not really sure. But that's just how we work. And I didn't understand too much about this, but I believe the bots act the same way. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how the bots are programmed. But anyway, moving on. Complex affordance. Even though the main path leads to the right, the great affordance here is actually the alleyway. Since in video games, side slash hidden paths contain treasures, are advantages to reward player exploration. So that's pretty much it. We just tend to take alleyways, side paths, things that are not obvious because often we are rewarded for that. Now, in the real world, there are no treasure chests, as she says on the lecture. So we would most definitely just take the main path. Spatial affordance, the architectural concept of prospect and refuge safety. So prospect is view and refuge is safety. In this image, we have a prospect heavy and a refuge medium, I believe she says. In contrast, we have a refuge heavy. So even though there's a large window there with a big view, we are in this moment, in this space, looking much more to the inside of this cozy little place, which gives us this feeling of safety, and therefore it is a refuge heavy. Secondary prospect and refuge are places that are far away from us. Not exactly far away from us, but secondary means that it's not where we are. So where the player is. So the player is not here. The player is looking there. So that's. But if it was closer, but the player is still looking, it's still a secondary prospect refuge. So it's a spot where the player isn't that could provide prospect and or refuge. So this is a heavy affordance because the player when it goes there, he's gonna have refuge, he's gonna have view information. Now this is another type of prospect and refuge, which is the hidden. It is close, it is basically where we are, but we don't really know. But there's a promise. There could be a prospect and or refuge around the corner. So it's also something that attacks the player. And also, another type of affordance is the large walkable surface areas. So this is an affordance because a large area, as we saw on this, means that it attracts the player to walk. In contrast with little areas, actually I didn't say because if you look at the little areas, players avoid. And I think this is a gallery, by the way. This is not a video game. These are tracking of people, but we as people playing video games act the same way when you are controlling a character. In contrast, we have an example of heavy primary prospect and refuge. So this we have no prospect and refuge. We have just the promise here. But this we have a lot of primary prospect and refuge. We have a nice view and we have a good cover, a good refuge here. So what happens is, and this is how we control the movement, by the way. Isn't that nice? Because this is an affordance. The player is gonna move. Now here we have a lot of prospect and refuge, so the player is not moving. The player is not moving or moving at a slower pace. Also in this scene, there's a lot of enemies shooting at the player, so of course he's just not gonna just run around and get killed. So this is neither good or bad, but one of the tools to control the player pacing. Narrow, little walkable surface areas also play a role here. So this is how we control the pacing. Very nice. A recommendation book on affordances. Origin of Architectural Pleasure by Grant Hildebrand. Now we come back to the weenie. So another thing the weenie evokes is mystery. The castle in this case is promising us more to learn if we move closer because of its interesting profile, just a profile. It's interesting. And the extra details. So you can see there's a lot of intricate detail that we're gonna get more information if we come close. And also it's a secondary prospect since a high vantage point offers a view and therefore more information. So the player's gonna think, oh, if I go here and come up the stairs and look up, I can get a really good view and more information about the space I'm in. Now, another type of so this I don't think this is neither no, this is actually a type of affordance, sorry. And also a type of saliency in some cases, but this is different. It's wayfinding elements. This is how we construct building, and there's a nice actual book, yeah, image of the city, and I believe the terms used here are talked about are first talked about in this book. So we have the 5 types of wayfinding elements, which are very important for the for level design, which are landmarks, districts. So not it could be just a district if you're imagine if you're in a jungle and you see a district, it is a type of wayfinding. But I put this Chinatown for example, like if you're in a city and you see the elements of Chinatown, it is a district, so it is a wayfinding element because it has its own style. So linear things, just paths, roads, rivers, players are gonna walk across. It's a type of affordance. Edges, yeah, it actually correlates with movement prevention, and this is much context dependent. She talks about it could be a river if you're in a car or on foot, but it could be land if you're in a boat. So that's why it's context dependent. But edges usually means movement prevention. And of course, nodes, which are extremely important, moments of decision choice. These are converging points, intersections, town squares, train stations. Usually, uh, not usually, but a lot of times, you have games where this is just in the center of the game, and I can actually think of a really old game. Uh, you guys probably won't know or have played, but a Prince of Persia. I think a Prince of Persia, the stylized one, the cartoonish Prince of Persia. I don't even know which year it is from 2009, 2010 or something, maybe earlier. But it has the type. I'm gonna check out the level design on that game because I remember for some reason. I remember you had the maps and you have the converging element on the middle, but this is really so common in a lot of different games. So the book recommendation for these types of wayfinding elements. An academic paper on the network of reference frames theory, synthesis of graphs and cognitive maps. So movement recap. Silence and attention will control where the player looks and therefore where the camera looks. 2 types of saliency, bottom up and top down, being the strongest in task / goal oriented mode. Affordances will control where the player goes and therefore where the camera goes. Types of affordance are simple objects, surface, complex, and wayfinding elements. And now she moves on to time, which is actually really quick. So how do we control time in video games? She talks about in movies how we control by editing and the camera. So we have this type of control, but uh, Space, she talks about how space is experienced through time. So if you walk into a room, you don't immediately take the room, read all the room, the entire room. You read element by element, so that takes time, and that's how we control the the time. And I'm gonna explain a bit better here. So repetition equals rhythm. We can set up rhythm with architectural repetition. Now, unfortunately, I just took a screenshot, but on the presentation, if you go and watch, the character is actually running here. So the columns on the left closer together create a much more intense rhythm. They pass really quickly. You can't really read what's going on here. And that's why it creates this intense feeling. On the other hand, on the columns on the right, they are further apart, more readable, and a slower rhythm. So this is how we can change the time. We can change the density over space to affect the intensity over time. Another book recommendation, Experience Architecture. Okay, so much like movies or books, video games are more engaging with a flow of intensity. What does that mean? Means that we don't want to be high intensity all the time, and we don't want to be low intensity all the time. So high intensity constantly overwhelming the player, and they can also become numb to it. And low intensity constantly equals boring. That's pretty much it. This is an interesting image of Disneyland. And she talks about transitions here, how we have specific elements to this part and specific elements to this part that are different. But you can see that here there is a sort of, by the way, ignore the orange. I think the orange is a, I can't even see it. It looks like it's pointing to a tree, but she said that it's not relevant to neither here. But we can see that they overlap a bit. So we have a bit of elements from this area here and a bit of elements from this area here. So this is how we create a more dissolving transition between the areas. So it's not, you don't want to just abruptly transition one area to another. This is a common good practice in level design. So transition is how we go from one space to the next. In this image we have, okay, I just explained this, creating a stylistic dissolve. Another example of stylistic dissolve. This is a area with round elements, and she talks about how she didn't want to make this area boring by, if it was just two edge, square, and straight elements, it would be boring. And this is a club, but these belong to the same area. So if you go from this area to this area, it's gonna be too abrupt. So here she does some sort of a stylistic dissolve, keeping a feel of the straight lines here and here and here, but also the round element. Another book recommendation. Okay, for recap, even though we can't control the camera, we can control the environment that the player moves through, so we can create cinematic experience by controlling the environment. 2D screen, composing the 3D for how it looks in 2D. Beyond that, everything else is the normal device that you get from other media, like creating good compositions, depth, and nice shapes on the screen. Movement is about saliencies and affordances. Saliency is controlling where the player looks, bottom up and top down saliency. Affordances are controlling where the player is going, object, surface, spatial, and complex affordances. Also, wayfinding elements. With time, space is experienced over time. We can control that with rhythm and repetition. Also with transition elements. And that's it. Uh, so that's pretty much it. I think I can just wrap up. But all right. So if you have any questions, any suggestions, just put in a comment down below and I'll see you on the next. Thank you so much.